It's time I went to check out the bunkhouse because I cannot see a reflection in the farthest window, which makes me think that maybe that window's been broken out. Maybe by a bear, maybe by something else. As I got closer to the bunkhouse, I could actually see that that window is not broken, which is a good thing. I'm not sure how easy it would be to break these windows anyhow, because all the windows in here are out of an old vehicle. So I'm pretty sure they're tempered glass. They might have some type of a film on them, which might prevent them from breaking through, though a bear still could do that very easily. But I'm glad that at least a bear or a person has not broken into here. Though something has been in here, and the last time I was in here, I set out some traps because there's evidence of mice having been in here. I'm not going to get a close-up of this chair, but currently it's got some mouse droppings in it, and what looks like insulation from the ceiling is all over that chair beside me. All the traps I put in November, though, are gone. I don't see a single one of them. And it's kind of funny because this was where my contractors stayed. They're the ones that set up this as their living quarters while they worked on the main cabin. And they have a package of candy sitting here that hasn't been messed with. There's some other candy, some sugar, and other food items in the kitchen that don't look like they've been messed with either. So that's good to see. I'm pretty sure, though, that since my traps are missing, that an ermine probably came in and took them. Now, ermine are really tiny, but they're not as small as a mouse, and I'm not sure if they can fit through the same size opening that a mouse can. But up at this end of the cabin and that end of the cabin, right next to this light fixture, you can see a little bit of light poking through. There's a square cutout right there that's hinged. I don't know what that was originally for. Those are nailed shut currently, but I still think a mouse could fit through that opening. Like I said, though, I don't know if an ermine could. But nonetheless, I'm glad to see that nothing has broken into here. But as I'm looking around the bunkhouse and thinking about how I want to get this fixed up so that if I have guests come up and stay with me, that this is where they would stay as opposed to having to stay in the main cabin. Give them a little bit of home away from home, if you will. I sit here and I think about, at one point, I was willing to live in a cabin this small. But remember that first winter I was here, I was snowed in for months. And I don't think I could have survived living in a space this tiny. I like my things, and that is one of the reasons why I'm glad that I have the cabin that I do. But at one point, I would have been comfortable with this. I get a lot of questions about the lifestyle that I live here. Why Alaska? Why am I doing this alone? And how can I afford to live this way? Well, I hope to answer some of those questions for you today. But let me just start out by saying that this all started with something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and for some of you has been the voice in your head for many decades, and that is the voice of Dick Proenneke and his story. For me, when I first was introduced to the Dick Proenneke documentaries, I was fairly young. I'd been married for a couple of years, and I had small children. And my at then time husband, he also loved the idea of Dick Proenneke and coming to Alaska. But for him, I don't think he ever really thought about moving to Alaska. For me, that was always where my brain went when thinking about Dick Proenneke, is I would love to live like that. I would love to live in Alaska, even though at that point I had not been to Alaska. And because of the fact that I had small children, I knew that my children came first. My family was my first priority. And so I kind of put the whole idea of coming to Alaska to live on a back burner. It was something that crossed my mind every now and then. Years later, I had the opportunity to come to Alaska with my family on a cruise. And that's what turned my passing thought into an obsession. After coming here and seeing how beautiful this state is, getting to experience the little bit that I got to experience on that cruise, I was hooked. And I remember telling my dad, if ever I disappeared, to not come look in Alaska, because this is exactly where I would be. Now, while I was starting to become obsessed with the idea of moving to Alaska and how beautiful Alaska is, I still had a family that I needed to take care of. By this time, my children were starting to grow and I was now divorced. As my children got older, I started overlanding, which meant that I had outfitted my Jeep to allow me to camp with inside my Jeep. I constructed this tent that I could connect to the back of the Jeep that gave me a place to stand up and sit in the shade or get out of the elements while camping. And every opportunity I had, I was traveling through as many states as I possibly could and camping at as many primitive campsites as I was able to do. I wish I'd started my YouTube channel back then because I saw some amazing sights. In fact, one of the things that I got to experience was I was traveling through Montana and through the Sawtooth Mountains. I pulled off at this roadside stop where there was this waterfall across this ravine. I remember sitting there watching the waterfall and eating some lunch. I was eating a can of sardines and some crackers when out of nowhere came a juvenile bear heading straight towards me. I'm sure it was the scent of those sardines that attracted him, but I was able to scare him off, and I got some video of him running away back up towards the highway. But I'd seen a million other amazing, I exaggerate, but I saw a ton of other amazing sights that I wish I had captured. And so that's why I do my YouTube channel, is so that I can capture those memories. I have a place to document them. I can share them with my family and I can share them with you guys, especially those of you who are wanting to move to Alaska but may never get that opportunity, because there was a long time where I thought I would never make it here, but I was, like I said, obsessed with the idea of doing so. I thought that I was doing everything in my power to get to Alaska. But it was years later when I realized that maybe I wasn't doing things that would allow me to live the way that I do now. And it was thanks to my ex-husband and to some of my coworkers that I took it from just a dream that I was obsessing over to actually putting it into an actionable plan. Like I said, I was so obsessed with the idea of moving here that it was all I ever talked about. And I became the butt of a running joke amongst my friends and my coworkers, where they were starting to call me the girl who cried Alaska, because it was all I talked about. In fact, a lot of people didn't want to associate with me anymore because I was a one topic person, and you guessed it, it was coming here. So I had this boss who used to tell me, you're never making it to Alaska. You're never going to move there. 10 years from now, you'll still be here. You just are all talk and no action. When he said that to me, I thought, when have I ever been all talk and no action? If I say I'm going to do something, I do it. I've never been one to tell myself that there's something I can't do, or I wish I could do that and then not follow through on it. But I realized when he said that I really hadn't done anything to get myself here. That really all I was doing was talking and dreaming. Yeah, I was doing a lot of research. I was looking all the time for land in Alaska, but I didn't really know where to look or what I was even looking for. At that point, I had even considered living in an outfitter's tent. I had seen a video of a lady who was living in an outfitter's tent in a remote wilderness in the Canadian Yukon year round. And I thought, if she could do it, I could do it. I saw a video of a young couple. I believe they were up in Manly Hot Springs. They had built a platform, put a outfitter's tent on it, and then built their cabin around it. As the cabin got built, they took the outfitter's tent down, and then they had a wonderful cabin to live in. And so for the longest time, I thought that I would be doing something similar because I didn't have a whole lot of money. I didn't have a way of financing my way up here. I knew that I also needed to wait for my kids to grow and move out and start living their own adult lives. What really took me from looking at random pieces of land that were being offered on the state's land sales to getting here was that my ex-husband had this big water jug, you know, one of those like 3 or 5 gallon water jugs that you can fill up at the grocery store. He had one of those that he had stuffed full of change. And he always said that that was his Alaska money. And I got to looking at that jar one day and I was thinking, he has more money in that jar than I have saved to get me here. And all he wants to do is take a vacation. And I actually want to move here. And there was one other thing that had happened previously that had stuck with me over the years. While I was in Juneau, I had taken a fishing excursion, and the captain of that boat was from Colorado. He and his wife had been planning a trip up to Alaska, and it wasn't long before they realized how expensive the vacation was going to cost them to come up here for just a week. And they figured out that if they had just bought a 20-foot cargo container, that they could fill that with their possessions and move to Alaska for the same cost that it was going to take for them to take a cruise up here. And so that's what they did. And so over the years, I had kept that idea rambling around in the back of my head. And so for the longest time, that's what I thought that I was going to do. Either an outfitter's tent or just live in a small cabin like the bunkhouse is. For the longest time, I thought that that would suit my needs. It was only after I got to realizing that I wasn't doing anything actionable, all I was doing was daydreaming, that I began to look at making some changes in my life. So thanks to my ex-husband's change jar, I made some changes. And one of the very first things that I did was I looked at my finances and I looked to see where was there an opportunity to trim the fat from my spending. So I got rid of all my subscriptions and I also stopped going out to eat. I used to eat out a lot and I used to get a lot of fast food because, you know, you're working away from home and you need lunch, and so you go out with your coworkers to grab a bite to eat, or you grab Starbucks on your way to work. And I won't even begin to tell you how much money I used to spend on Starbucks. It's shameful the amount that I used to spend. And it was at that point that I realized that I could be putting away $10,000 a year if I just didn't spend on average around $28 a day. And you're probably thinking that you don't spend $28 a day now. So how can you afford to do that? Well, I wasn't either necessarily, but I might spend $5 this day, $10 that day, and then maybe somewhere down the line spend $100. And when I averaged it all out, I was wasting a lot of money. And I realized that I could be better about how I was investing money. One of the smartest things I ever did was have a 401k with matching. And so I put in the maximum amount of money I could into my 401k and let the company match up to their maximum amount. And that let me, if I needed to borrow money, borrow against my own bank as opposed to somebody else's, so that I wasn't losing money in interest paid back to a financier. One of the other things that I did is I bought a house. Before this point, I was renting. And when you move out of a rental property, you don't get anything back from it, except for maybe your deposit if you're lucky. And I realized that over the years of renting that I had lost a lot of opportunity to make some equity by having my own place. Additionally, I was working multiple jobs. Sometimes I was cleaning houses on the sides, and other times it was just a part-time job. And then I would use that money to build up my reserves, whether that was savings or I was investing it. Additionally, I would use credit cards, and I typically don't think most people use credit cards in a very wise way, but something that I had learned from Boss of the Swamp was to use those credit cards in a way that pays you back. So when I bought my groceries, I would do it with the credit card, and then I would pay that credit card off at the end of the month. So I wasn't paying any interest on those charges, and the cash back advances that were offered, I would then use to pay down other bills. I would always start with my lowest bill, pay that off, and then once it was paid off, I would take the money that was going to that bill and apply it to my next lowest bill until that one was paid off, and then take the accumulative funds from those and apply them to the next bill, and so on and so forth, until eventually I was able to pretty much pay off all my bills. The only bill that I did not ever attempt to pay off was my house. The reason for this is that I knew that I wasn't going to be staying in that home for more than a few years. And while I could have made additional principal payments to lower the amount of interest that I was paying, it meant that I would have lost that tax write-off at the end of the year. And also, I was taking that money and investing it elsewhere where I had a higher rate of return on my money. So in other words, I put my money to work for me. I only made my monthly payment so I could stay in the house. The bank got the loan paid off, and I got the proceeds of the sale above and beyond what my loan cost was. But that doesn't mean that I didn't spend money. I did spend money on things like overlanding, on fishing, and things like that. Now, overlanding, for the most part, I did that all within Colorado or the neighboring states, and I could do that for less than a quarter tank of gas. And at that time, gas prices were not as costly as they are today. And then when I was going fishing, for the most part, I was picking up things like this tackle box at garage sales, or I was buying them on sale at Walmart. I didn't really care about having the brand name products. So that was one other thing, was learning to compromise on what I was buying to a point. I do believe in buying quality items, but I don't necessarily believe in paying the retail market price for those items. If I can pick them up secondhand and it's something that I know is of value, I'm going to do that. Not only was I obsessed with the idea of moving to Alaska and becoming debt-free, but I also became obsessed with becoming as self-sufficient as possible. So I learned to garden. Once I started growing my own food, then I needed to learn how to preserve that food. So I learned to can and dehydrate, as well as how to store root crops and have them last me until the next harvest. One other thing that I learned to do was I learned how to shop for groceries. Before, I used to go to the grocery store every few days, but I began to realize that the more frequently I went to the store, the more likely I was to spend money that I didn't really have. So I learned a meal plan, and then eventually I learned that I could buy groceries twice a year and very infrequently have to go to the store again during that time frame. I've shown on my channel how I freeze things like milk and cream and butter so that they can last for the duration between shopping trips. And I also buy things that have a long shelf life, such as this cranberry juice up here. It actually has a 2-year shelf life. So when it's on sale, I made sure that I bought some and that I had it on hand for when I needed some. I don't buy soda, so this is my soda of choice. It's just to mix some of that in with some water. One other thing that I do is if I'm going to buy meat, I make sure that that meat can last for as many meals as possible. A chicken could last me possibly 3 or 4 meals or more by divvying it up and using it wisely. If there were leftovers, that became my lunches. Or sometimes I would fix enough that I could freeze it and have it for a meal for my family at another time. Learning to be wise in how I bought my groceries, how I grew my food, and how I stored my food was one of the other obsessions that I had taken on, and one of the reasons why I can afford to live the way that I do today. And I became obsessed with learning, and I use YouTube to do a lot of that. I started off, like I said, watching Boss of the Swamp when his channel first came about and followed him through the years. But I was watching channels like Townsend, learning how to do things in the 18th century. Then I started watching channels like Meat Eater and learning how to hunt and process game, which led me then eventually to Raised in Alaska, who has a fabulous channel and has been posting for the past 8 years. I watched Bush Radical, and as time went on, I took on other channels like Gnomestead Off-Grid Alaska and Mountain Mariner Off-Grid Alaska. These are fabulous channels that I've recommended on my channel previously, and ones that I highly encourage you to check out as well. So YouTube became a great resource for me. And I also have a pretty robust library that allows me to have knowledge right there at my fingertips whenever I need it. One other thing that I did in my obsession is I started living this way back in Colorado. So I wanted to know, could I really do this? Could I really live off grid? I didn't need to wait to get here to find out that I wasn't going to be able to do this, that I didn't enjoy this lifestyle. I did it while I had modern conveniences that I could use. I just decided not to use them. At night, when the sun would go down, I would turn off the lights in the house and I would use a flashlight or a headlamp to find my way around my home. At the beginning of me doing that, my neighbors would see this little light making its way through the house and they thought that someone had broken in. Luckily, they didn't call the cops because it would have been kind of embarrassing to explain what I was doing. So I had already grown up doing dishes by hand, so that was nothing new to me. But I was doing my laundry in my bathtub and using a mangle at home to wring out my clothes and hang them up to line dry, even though I had a perfectly good washer and dryer in my basement. My point being is that all of the things that I became obsessed with eventually landed me here. They eventually got me to the lifestyle that I had dreamt about early on. In Colorado, I had a 2-car attached garage on my house, but I never actually used my garage for my vehicle. I used it just to hold the items that I was purchasing to use once I arrived in Alaska. If I was going to purchase something, it had to be practical and it had to be of a benefit to me once I arrived in Alaska. So I began to purchase tools at estate sales, auctions, garage sales, or even at a sale at a local big box store. Either way, these items are all mine. They're not my ex-husband's, and they're not some former boyfriend's. I don't know of any man who's going to relinquish his tools, especially to his ex. But I also put YouTube to good use in this case as well, because it taught me how to use these tools and how to have some basic carpentry skills that allowed me to build things such as these shelves or my kitchen counter upstairs. And I'll be building additional projects throughout the cabin as the years go by. But I couldn't have done it if I didn't make these purchases when I did. No matter what, I was determined to make my dream a reality, and I have no problem admitting that I was obsessed in making that happen. And I hope that all your dreams come true as well. I know there are many of you who are living vicariously through this channel and others who just want to see how people in Alaska live and do the things that we do in these extreme conditions that we have up here. Either way, I hope that your dreams all come true as well. And I want to say thank you for watching today's video. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and remember to give this video a thumbs up if you found it interesting or entertaining. Until the next time, please stay safe and take care, and I'll see you then.